The auctioneer's gavel had not yet fallen when Anna Chandler understood, with a clarity that cut through the noise and dust of the crowded Caldwell, Kansas town square, that she was about to be sold. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Kansas plains stretched out in every direction like a rumpled brown blanket thrown carelessly across the earth, and the town of Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kisham Trail, where cattle drives churned the main street into perpetual mud, and the saloons ran full from sunup to sundown. Anna had arrived 3 weeks prior on a stagecoach from St. Louis, carrying a single leather traveling bag and a letter of employment from a man named Douglas Holt, who had advertised in the Missouri Dispatch for a housekeeper of good moral character to tend to his ranch home 12 miles east of town. She had been 22 years old, recently widowed after 7 months of marriage to a sickly man twice her age who had left her nothing but debt and a tarnished name, and the advertisement had seemed like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something broken. It had not been the beginning of anything good. Douglas Holt was not what his advertisement had promised. He was a broad, ruddy-faced cattleman of 50 who chewed tobacco constantly and spoke to his horses with more courtesy than he extended to any woman in his household. He had 3 hands employed on his ranch, and a foreman named Cleet who looked at Anna in the particular way that made her skin crawl from the moment she stepped down from the wagon that had brought her from town. Within the first week, she had understood that the position of housekeeper was a polite fiction. What Holt wanted was a woman on the property who had nowhere else to go and no legal recourse, and what Anna had was exactly that. She worked from before sunrise until well after dark, cooking and cleaning and mending, and when she asked about her wages at the end of the second week, Holt had laughed a short, unpleasant laugh and told her she was working off the cost of her travel from St. Louis, which he had arranged, which was apparently a debt she owed him. She had tried to leave on a Sunday. Cleet had followed her down the road in the buckboard and brought her back without raising his voice or his hand, but in a way that made the absence of both feel more threatening than their presence would have. She had written a letter to the postmistress in Caldwell. She did not know if it was ever sent. And then on a Tuesday morning in October, Douglas Holt had ridden into Caldwell with Anna sitting rigid in the wagon beside him, wearing her only good dress, which was a deep blue wool that her mother had made for her, and which she now wished she had left buried at the bottom of her bag, so Holt could not have made her wear it for this particular occasion. He had told her only that there was business to attend to in town. He had not told her what kind. The town square of Caldwell was arranged as it often was for cattle business, with men standing in loose groups and a wooden platform erected near the old livery, where the auctioneer typically stood to sell off unclaimed horses or surplus stock. But on this Tuesday the platform held something else, and when the men began to crowd, and when Anna saw how they arranged themselves, and when the auctioneer, a thin man in a brown vest named Perkins, called out that the proceeding was about to begin, she understood what was happening with a cold and terrible clarity. Holt was selling her contract, or selling something. The legal substance of what exactly he was auctioning was dressed in careful language about indentured labor agreements and outstanding debts and domestic service contracts. But the men standing in that square knew what they were looking at, and so did Anna, and so did the handful of women who watched from a distance with their mouths pressed into thin, unhappy lines. There were 7 men in the bidding circle. Anna could see them all from where she stood at the edge of the platform, her hands clasped in front of her, her chin held at an angle she had decided on during the wagon ride as the only posture left to her that resembled dignity. She counted them in the way she had always counted things when she was frightened, which was a habit from childhood that her father had called her arithmetic courage. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 men, and every one of them looked at her in the same way, with that slow measuring assessment that she recognized as the way a man looks at a horse he is considering purchasing, running his eyes along the lines of the animal and calculating return on investment. Every one of them looked at her that way, except one. He was standing at the back of the cluster, slightly apart from the others, and he was not looking at her at all. He was looking at the auctioneer. He was looking at Holt. He was looking at the paper that Perkins held up and reading whatever was written on it with the careful attention of a man who was trying to understand the legal dimensions of what he was witnessing. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean in the way that men who work outdoors become lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and a plain canvas work coat and boots that had seen serious miles. He wore a hat that he had pushed back slightly on his head, which meant she could see his face, and his face was not the face of a man conducting livestock appraisal. He looked angry. That was what she saw, not at her, at the situation, at Holt. At the auctioneer and his thin brown vest, and his gavel and his cheerful indifference to what he was facilitating. When his eyes finally did move to her briefly, it was not the measuring look. It was something else entirely, something that contained the same cold recognition she felt herself, the acknowledgement that this was wrong, that it was wrong in a way that went past the edges of what polite society would name out loud in the Kansas Territory in 1878, but wrong nonetheless, and that both of them understood it. She looked away first. She had to, because if she did not look away, she was going to do something that would make everything worse. The bidding opened at $40. She stared at a point above the heads of the crowd and kept her breathing as level as she could manage. 50, 65, 70. The man in the canvas coat was still reading the paper. His jaw was set in a way that suggested he was doing something deliberate and controlled with his temper. 75 from a rancher named Barwell who had a red beard and kept touching the brim of his hat in a way she supposed he imagined was charming. 80 from one of the others. She stopped tracking who was saying what number because it did not feel like numbers anymore. It felt like something else. 90. The man in the canvas coat raised his hand. $100, he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried, because it was the kind of voice that carried, steady and deliberate, the voice of a man who did not raise it often but who was heard when he did. There was a small pause. Barwell squinted and looked at the canvas coat man and seemed to make some assessment. 110, Barwell said. 150, the canvas coat man said, without hesitation, with the flat finality of someone who has decided what a thing is worth and is not interested in the negotiation itself, only in the outcome. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It was the silence of a number that had put the decision beyond most of what the other bidders were prepared to commit. Barwell looked at the ground. The others shuffled. Holt, from his position near the platform, watched with the expression of a man who was satisfied. "Sold," Perkins said, and the gavel came down. Anna felt the word in her sternum like a struck bell. The canvas coat man did not move immediately toward the platform. Instead, he walked directly to Douglas Holt and said something low and direct that she could not hear. Holt's expression shifted slightly, just slightly, and he handed over the paper he'd been holding. The transaction of money followed, counted carefully from a worn leather wallet, and then the man in the canvas coat turned toward the platform where Anna still stood and walked to her with the same deliberate, unhurried pace with which he'd done everything else. He stopped a respectful distance from her. He took his hat off, which surprised her. Men in Caldwell did not always take their hats off for women who were not their wives or their mothers or women of particular social standing. "Miss," he said, "my name is Ira Barker. I have just purchased what Holt there was calling your service contract, which is to say I've paid $150 for a piece of paper that I intend to tear up the moment we are off this square. I'd like to explain this to you before anything else so that you know my purpose." She looked at him. She did not say anything yet. She was still calculating. "I know Tom Reedy at the sheriff's office," he continued, "and I know the circuit judge passes through next month, and what Holt has been doing is not legal under Kansas statute, even if he has been doing it anyway." but I need you to be willing to talk to the sheriff about what happened on that ranch, and I want you to know that you have a choice in this. You are not obligated to come with me or to speak to anyone or to do anything. I will take you to the hotel on Main Street right now and pay for a room for as long as you need it, and that is a separate thing from all the rest, and there are no conditions on it." She had been watching his face throughout this. She had learned to read faces in the years since her mother died and left her largely to her own navigation of the world, and she read his face now the way she had learned to read them, looking for the thing underneath the words. She did not find the livestock appraisal look. She did not find calculation or entitlement or the particular brand of male self-congratulation she had encountered in men who performed kindness as a prelude to expectation. She found, instead, a kind of controlled fury that was directed at the situation and not at her, and underneath that, something quieter and more tentative, something that looked very much like genuine concern. "Why?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Why did you come here today? Why did you bid?" He was quiet for a moment. "I heard last week that Holt was planning this. Word gets around among the hands in this part of the territory, and one of his ranch hands who didn't like what was happening rode to my spread and told me. I came because I did not think anyone else was going to." "You could have gone to the sheriff before today," she said. "I tried," he said. "Reedy said he needed a complaint from the woman herself. He said without that his hands were tied by the wording of the contract Holt had filed." She looked past him toward the square, where the crowd was already dispersing, men moving back toward the saloons and the livery and the ordinary Tuesday business of their lives. Holt was walking toward his wagon with his foreman. He did not look back at her. "All right, Mr. Barker," she said. "I'll speak to the sheriff." His shoulders dropped slightly, and she realized he had been bracing for a different answer. They walked together to the sheriff's office. Tom Reedy was a sunburned man in his 40s with a thick mustache who listened to Anna's account with his hat in his hands and an expression of genuine discomfort that she appreciated because it meant he understood the weight of what she was telling him. She described the false employment advertisement, the debt claim Holt had invented, the foreman cleat following her when she tried to leave, the auction she had just stood through. She spoke all of it without particular emotion, because emotion costs something, and she was already running at a deficit. Reedy wrote things down. He said he would ride to the Holt ranch that afternoon with a deputy. He said Holt would be formally charged under the state statutes governing unlawful servitude and contract fraud. He said the circuit judge would deal with it properly when he came through. He also said, with the specific discomfort of a man saying something he knew was inadequate, that he was sorry for what she had been through. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, and she meant it, and she also recognized that sorry changed nothing about the 3 weeks that had already happened. She and Ira Barker walked out into the afternoon sun together, and she stood on the boardwalk and took a long breath of air that smelled of horse and dust and wood smoke and did not smell like the Holt Ranch kitchen, and she felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, something that was not quite relief but was at least the precondition of it. "The hotel," Ira said, gesturing down the street. "I meant what I said, no conditions." "You tore up that paper," she said. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced 2 rough halves of paper and held them up, and then let them fall. The October wind took them and scattered them across the boardwalk, and she watched them go. "Thank you," she said. "It was nothing that needed thanks," he said, which she noted was different from saying it was nothing. The hotel was called the Caldwell House, and it was a narrow 2-story building with clean enough rooms and a proprietress named Mrs. Alderman, who had the shrewd, incurious eyes of a woman who had seen most things and had opinions about all of them. Ira paid for a week's lodging, and Anna stood beside him at the desk feeling the profound strangeness of her situation, which was that she was in a town she barely knew, with no employment, no money, no bag because the bag was still at the Holt Ranch, dependent on the generosity of a man she had met 3 hours ago, and freer than she had been in 3 weeks. "I'll get your bag," Ira said, as if he'd heard the thought. I'll ride to Holt's tomorrow morning with Reedy. My blue dress is in it, she said, and then felt foolish for saying it. Because of everything in the bag, the blue dress was the least important item, and also the one she felt most about because of her mother. And she had not meant to let that particular piece of vulnerability out into the open quite so quickly. I'll make sure the blue dress comes back, he said, and said it simply, without turning it into anything it wasn't. Mrs. Alderman showed her to a room on the second floor that overlooked the main street, with a window that let in the afternoon light, and a quilt on the bed that was faded but clean. When the proprietress left her alone, Anna sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hands flat on her knees and breathed, and then she cried for about 5 minutes in the particular efficient way she had developed for crying since her husband died, which was to let it come completely and then put it away completely and then go on. She went on. Over the next several days, she settled into the irregular rhythms of a woman with a room of her own and no particular obligations, which was a state she found both restorative and quietly nerve-wracking. She ate breakfast in the dining room downstairs and walked the length of Caldwell's Main Street and acquainted herself with the town. She spoke at length to Mrs. Alderman, who turned out to be a woman of considerable wit and information, and through her she learned the basic geography of the community, who the decent people were and who the less decent ones were, and where the various necessities of life could be obtained. She learned a few things about Ira Barker as well, from Mrs. Alderman, and from the casual conversational drift of a small western town. He was 28 years old, originally from eastern Tennessee, who had come west at 23 after the death of both parents and a younger sister from a fever that had gone through their county like a slow fire. He had worked cattle drives on the Kisham for 2 years, saving wages, and then 3 years ago had purchased a modest spread of his own 12 miles north of Caldwell, 160 acres with a creek running through the eastern portion, and a small but solid house he had spent the first winter improving. He ran a small cattle operation and did some horse trading, and according to Mrs. Alderman, he was known as a fair and honest man, which in Caldwell in 1878 was not a universal quality in men who owned land and ran cattle. He had not married. There had, according to Mrs. Alderman, been a woman in town 2 years back whose name was not offered, who had gone back east, and there were no particular details available about that situation beyond the bare fact of it. On the third day after the auction, he came to the Caldwell house in the early afternoon with her leather bag, which contained everything she had left in it, including the blue dress, nothing missing or disturbed. He also brought the information that Sheriff Reedy had formally charged Douglas Holt, and that Holt had retained a lawyer from Wichita, but that Reedy was confident in the case. Anna thanked him at the door of the hotel, and he nodded and turned to go, and she said, "Mr. Barker, would you have supper with me tonight? In the dining room here. I owe you a meal at the very least." He turned back, and there was a moment where she could see him deciding something, some internal negotiation she was not privy to, and then he said yes. Supper in the Caldwell house dining room was a practical affair of beef stew and corn bread and strong coffee, but the conversation was better than the food. She had not, she realized partway through the meal, had an actual conversation with a person since St. Louis, because the weeks at Holt's Ranch did not qualify, and the interactions with Reedy and Mrs. Alderman were transactional rather than conversational, and she had missed talking. She had missed talking considerably. She found that Ira Barker was easy to talk to in the way that a few people are, not because he performed ease, but because he was genuinely interested in what she said, which was rarer than it should have been. She told him about St. Louis and her father's carpentry shop, and the education she'd gotten at a Methodist school there, and the books she had read and missed having access to. She told him about her husband briefly, because it seemed important to be honest about the shape of her life, and she said only that it had been a practical arrangement, and that she had cared for him in the way one cares for a person one is responsible for, and that she had been sorry when he died. Ira told her about Tennessee and the drives and about building his house, and about a horse he had that was giving him trouble, and about the way the sky looked over the Kansas plains on clear nights, which he described with a specificity that told her he paid attention to it. When supper was over and they were standing in the foyer of the hotel, he said, "I know you're sorting out what comes next. If you need a reference or a character letter for employment anywhere in the area, I'd be glad to provide one. I know most of the decent families within 20 miles. I'm considering my options," she said. "I do need employment. I'm also considering whether I want to stay in Caldwell at all." "Do you have somewhere else to be?" he asked. "No," she said. "That's the honest answer. I have no family left and I have no money, and the only advantage I have at this moment is that I have some freedom of decision, which I am not disposed to waste." "That seems like a reasonable way to think about it," he said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. "Come have supper again tomorrow," she said. "If you're willing." He was willing. He came back the next evening, and the one after that, and by the end of the first week he was coming every day. Not always for supper, sometimes just in the afternoon, bringing whatever news he had from the county or sometimes no news at all, and they would sit in the small parlor off the dining room that Mrs. Alderman made available for respectable visitors, and they would talk until the light went. Sometimes he brought her things, practical things, a good pen because she mentioned she liked to write letters, a copy of a Harper's magazine someone had left at the general store, once a small bunch of late wildflowers that he handed over with a brevity that suggested he was not entirely sure it had been the right thing to bring and was committed to it anyway, which she found entirely endearing. She thought about it carefully, because she was a woman who thought carefully about things, and she decided at the end of 10 days that she was falling in love with Ira Barker in the particular way that felt least like falling and most like arriving somewhere she had not known she was headed until she was already nearly there. She also decided that this was complicated for several reasons, the first being that she was financially dependent on his generosity in a way that could poison any feeling she expressed toward him, because he would never know if she meant it or was simply paying a debt she could not pay otherwise, and she would never know if he believed her, and that uncertainty was the kind of thing that could erode everything. The second reason was that she had come to Caldwell through a situation of such specific vulnerability that she was not entirely confident in her own judgment about men, because her judgment about men had not served her particularly well in recent history. The third reason was that she was not sure what he felt. She watched him. She was good at watching. He was careful with her in a way that she read as respect, but that also might have been simply his nature. He was careful and quiet with most things. He was careful with his horse and careful with his words and careful with the feelings of other people in the room, which was a quality she valued more highly than most because she had spent considerable time around people who were not careful in this way at all. But careful did not mean interested, and she would not assume interested until she had better evidence. The better evidence came on the 14th day after the auction. He had arrived at the Caldwell house in the afternoon to tell her that the circuit judge had arrived early, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and that Holt's case would be heard Friday, which meant her testimony would be needed. He sat across from her in the parlor and explained what Reedy had told him about the process and what she would need to say, and she listened and asked questions and was glad for the preparation. When the practical business was finished, there was a pause, and he said, without particular preamble, "I want to say something, and I want to be clear about what I mean by it so you can take it as it is intended and not as something else." She looked at him. "All right. I have been coming here every day," he said, "because I want to. Not out of obligation and not because I think you need looking after, because you are the most capable person I have met in a long while, and you do not need looking after. I come because I want to talk to you, and I want to know what you think about things, and I want to know how your day went. And I understand that the circumstances of how we met are complicated, and I do not want you to feel any pressure from me. But I thought you should know why I keep coming. She sat with this for a moment. I wondered, she said. I was not certain. Now you're certain, he said. Now I'm certain, she agreed. Another pause. Outside, someone was driving a wagon down the main street, and the noise of it filled the moment between them and then passed. I want to come tomorrow as well, he said. If that is all right with you. It is all right with me, she said. He left shortly after, and she sat in the parlor alone for a while and looked out the window at the deepening evening sky over the Kansas plains, which was, as he had said, a considerable sky, full of color at this hour, and she thought about the word arriving, which was the word she had used to herself about what was happening to her, and she thought it still seemed like the right word. Friday came, and she gave her testimony before the circuit judge, a formal, dry-voiced man named Harper who wrote everything down and asked precise questions, and seemed genuinely troubled by the details of what she described, not in a theatrical way, but in the quiet way of a man who had a daughter, and was doing arithmetic he did not particularly enjoy. Holt's lawyer from Wichita made several arguments about the validity of the service contract under Kansas labor law, and Reedy presented his evidence, and the whole proceeding took most of the morning. Judge Harper ruled that afternoon. The service contract was declared void under state law governing involuntary servitude. Holt was fined $200 and formally barred from filing any further such agreements with the county clerk. The judge also, in a move that surprised Reedy and delighted Anna, ordered Holt to repay the $150 that Ira had spent at the auction, plus 10%, on the grounds that the auction itself had been fraudulent. It was not justice in the largest sense. It was not an accounting for the 3 weeks of unpaid labor and the loss of freedom and the particular cold terror of standing on that platform and being looked at the way those men had looked at her. But it was something, and something was not nothing, and the fine would follow Holt's public record, and the ruling would be filed, and the town knew what it knew. She walked out of the courthouse into the sharp October air, and Ira was waiting outside, hat in his hands again, and she told him what the judge had said, and he listened with his jaw set in that way she had come to recognize as the way he held himself when he was controlling the intensity of what he felt. He should have gone to prison, he said. Yes, she said, he should have. But the fine and the record, he said, and paused. It's something, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Are you all right? And she said, I am, and meant it, which surprised her a little. They walked together down the main street, and he bought her coffee at the cafe on the corner, and they sat at a small table by the window, and the afternoon light came in at a low angle and lay across the table between them in a way that made everything look warm, and she thought she would remember this particular afternoon for a long time, not because of the courthouse or the ruling, but because of the coffee and the light and the company. In the weeks that followed, something between them settled and deepened. She found employment at the schoolteacher's house, a Mrs. Pryor who needed a woman to help with household management, while her husband, the schoolteacher, dealt with the responsibilities of a new school district. And it was honest work at honest wages, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a person who is earning their own way again. She moved from the hotel to a room at a boarding house that Mrs. Alderman recommended, run by a widow named Mrs. Crane, who tolerated no nonsense and kept a clean house, and who decided within a week of Anna's arrival that Anna was a sensible young woman, and began providing her with the ongoing commentary on Caldwell society that was a boarding house, widow's particular gift to her residents. Ira still came. He came on Tuesday afternoons and Sunday mornings, which had become their established times, and on Sundays they often walked out past the edge of town onto the open land where the grass ran flat and gold and the sky was enormous, and they talked in the way they had always talked, about everything and nothing, about his cattle and her reading and the politics of the territory and the people of Caldwell and the things they both wanted from their lives. It was on one of those Sunday walks in November, with the first real cold coming in from the north and their breath making small brief clouds, and Anna wearing her wool coat and the blue dress underneath it because she wore it on occasions that felt worth wearing it for, that Ira stopped walking and turned to her and said something that she had been, in the quiet hours, expecting. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that the answer I want is the answer that is true for you, and not the answer you think I want, and not the answer that seems practical, and not any answer that comes from anything other than what you actually want. Do you understand what I mean by that?" "I understand," she said. "Are you happy?" he said. "Not in the way of general circumstances, but in the particular way, with this, with us. Are you happy?" She looked at him for a long moment. The wind came across the grass and moved through it in a shiver of sound, and the sky above them was the color of pale winter steel, and the plains ran away in every direction, wide and cold, and terribly honest in the way that open country always is, the kind of landscape that has no patience for anything that isn't true. "Yes," she said, "I am. I would like for it to continue to be this and to grow into something more, and I want to say that clearly because you have been very careful not to assume anything, and I appreciate that you have been careful, but I do not want my appreciation for your carefulness to read as uncertainty. I am not uncertain." The thing that happened to his face when she said this was something she stored carefully away in the collection of things she intended to keep forever. "Good," he said. His voice was not entirely level. "That is very good." He reached across and took her hand, which was the first time he had done that, and they stood there in the Kansas wind with the cold coming down from the north and the grass moving around them, and she felt, with great conviction, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. In December he proposed. He did it at her boarding house, in the small parlor that Mrs. Crane provided for visitors, without ceremony and without a speech prepared, which she appreciated enormously. He sat across from her and said he wanted to marry her, that he had been wanting to ask for weeks but had been waiting until he was sure she had had enough time to come to herself after everything that had happened, and that he wanted to be clear, it was not an offer made from pity or obligation, but from the fact that he was in love with her, and had been for some time, and the thought of her going anywhere or being anywhere except with him was one he found genuinely intolerable. She said yes before he finished. He blinked. "I hadn't gotten to the part about the ring yet." "The ring can come after," she said. "Say yes." "I just said it," he said. "I know I said it back. I'm saying it twice," she said. "Yes." He laughed, which was the first time she had heard him laugh at full volume, and it was a good laugh, surprised and whole, and she laughed too, and Mrs. Crane knocked on the parlor door and cracked it open to offer tea and saw their faces and said, "I'll put the good china out," and shut the door again. They were married in late January of 1879, on a day when the temperature had risen briefly into something almost mild, and the sky was clear, and the church on Caldwell's Main Street was full of more people than Anna had expected, because 3 months in a small western town was enough time to become known, and she had become known. Mrs. Alderman was there, and Mrs. Pryor and Mrs. Crane and Sheriff Reedy, and a dozen of the other faces that had become familiar to her over the months since October. Tom Reedy's wife brought a pie to the small gathering afterward and pressed Anna's hands and told her that Ira was a good man, that she could trust that Tom had known him 3 years and had never had occasion to doubt it. "I know," Anna said. "I know he is." She wore the blue dress under a new winter coat that Ira had bought her for Christmas, and she thought about her mother who had made the dress and thought she would have liked this day. The ride out to Ira's farm after the wedding was 12 miles north of Caldwell, through the flat winter land, with the horses moving at a steady pace, and the cold air in her face, and her new husband sitting beside her on the wagon seat with the reins easy in his hands, and his shoulder warm against hers. He had asked her before the wedding if she wanted to see the house before they were married, to know what she was moving into, and she had told him she preferred to see it as her home for the first time, which was different from seeing it as a property being inspected, and he had understood exactly what she meant. The house was not large, but it was solid, exactly as Mrs. Alderman had said, a two-room dwelling that Ira had extended with a kitchen addition and a covered porch that faced south to catch the light. He had done something with it in the weeks before the wedding that she understood immediately and felt in her chest, which was that he had made space for her in it, cleared room in the shelves for her books and her few personal things, hung a second hook by the door, made the bed with extra quilts because she had mentioned once in passing that she ran cold in winter. Small, careful, practical acts that said more than speeches. She put her hand on the doorframe of her new home and looked in at the fire burning in the hearth and the table set for two and said, quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to her mother, or perhaps just to the open air, "All right then," and went in. The first year of their marriage was a year of learning. Not the romantic learning of courtship, which they had already largely done, but the deeper learning of shared life, the discovery of each other's habits and rhythms and irritabilities and particular joys, the negotiation of a shared space and a shared future. She learned that Ira woke before dawn without fail, that he moved through the house in the early morning with a care for quiet that she appreciated because she did not wake easily, and that he left a cup covered and warming near the stove for her when he went out to the animals. She learned that he read when he could, that he had a small but good collection of books on a shelf near the window, and that he engaged with them seriously, and that conversations about what they were both reading were some of his favorite kind. She learned that he was patient with most things but had a specific, precise intolerance for dishonesty, not the intolerance of a man who had never been tempted to dishonesty himself, but the intolerance of a man who had decided it mattered and stuck to that decision. He learned that she was competent in ways that surprised people, and that she found this perpetual surprise mildly aggravating, that she could repair harness leather and navigate by stars, and do the arithmetic of the farm accounts in her head faster than he could with a pencil, and that she was not shy about pointing out when something had been done wrong, but was also genuinely interested in solving the problem rather than simply noting it. He learned that she was serious about the blue dress, that it came out for occasions of significance, and that when it came out it meant something. He learned that she cried efficiently and rarely, and that when she was truly troubled she went quiet in a specific way that was different from her ordinary quiet, and that the right response to the troubled quiet was presence, not words. The farm ran well. Ira had good instincts for cattle and had been building his herd carefully, and with Anna managing the household accounts with her unflinching arithmetic they had more end-of-year margin than Ira had achieved in previous years. She planted a kitchen garden in the spring that produced with generational enthusiasm, and she entered into cordial relations with their nearest neighbors, a family named Schultz who had a homestead 2 miles east and who had 2 daughters and a son, all under 12, who quickly adopted Anna as a woman of interest and could be found on the farm's porch with a frequency that both Barkers found entirely pleasant. In the summer of 1879, perhaps 8 months after the wedding, there was an incident that put the first real test to the life they were building. A man came to the farm one afternoon while Ira was out checking the herd on the east pasture. Anna was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horse, and she came around the side of the house to find that the man on the horse was Cleet, the foreman from the Holt Ranch, and that he was looking at her with an expression that made her stomach go cold. He was not there to threaten her. He was there, he said, with a message from Douglas Holt, which was that Holt held her responsible for the fine and for the damage to his reputation, and that this was not finished. He said this with a flat, careful delivery that was more frightening than shouting would have been. He did not get down from his horse. He said his piece and turned and rode out, and Anna stood in her kitchen garden and watched him go and then went into the house and sat down at the kitchen table and did her arithmetic courage. She counted what she knew. Holt had been publicly embarrassed and significantly fined. He was a prideful man. Prideful, humiliated men did things they should not do. Cleet was his instrument. She was 12 miles from Caldwell. She also knew that she was not going to pretend this had not happened or manage it quietly on her own, because she had learned in the months since October that managing things quietly on her own was not the point anymore. The point was different now. When Ira came in from the east pasture, she told him immediately and completely. He listened without interrupting, his expression going through several changes that she tracked, and when she finished he said, "When did this happen?" "About 2 hours ago." "Are you all right?" "I'm not hurt. I am not entirely comfortable, but I am all right." "I'm going to ride to Reedy tonight," he said. "I thought you would say that," she said. "I think it's the right thing to do." He rode to Caldwell and spoke to Reedy, who took the report seriously, and rode to the Holt Ranch the following morning with a deputy and a formal warning that any further contact with Ira Barker, however indirect, would result in immediate arrest on harassment charges. Cleet was gone from the Holt Ranch within 2 weeks. Holt, by all accounts, was too occupied with the legal costs of his situation and a second fine related to a separate cattle dispute to expend further energy on vengeance. And the following spring he sold his ranch and moved to Colorado, and that was the last Anna heard of Douglas Holt. The threat, while it lasted, had done something she had not expected, which was to clarify something for her. She had been watchful in herself, carefully watchful, since the auction, making sure she was not carrying fear she had not processed or anger she had not accounted for. But it was not until Cleet appeared on her horse, and she felt that cold stomach drop, and then sat down at her kitchen table and did her arithmetic and then, crucially, told her husband that she understood she had healed something. Not because the fear went away, but because the fear had not paralyzed her and had not made her smaller, and when it was over she had looked at the life she was living and found it unchanged in all the ways that mattered. She and Ira talked about it that evening after he returned from Caldwell, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Some," she said, "but not of the same things I was frightened of a year ago." "What were you frightened of a year ago?" He asked it carefully. "Of being trapped again," she said, "of having no choices again, of being made small." He was quiet for a moment. "And now?" "I am frightened of losing what I have," she said, "which is an entirely different kind of fear. It's the fear that comes from having something worth keeping." He reached across the table and she put her hand in his. "You're not going to lose it," he said. "I know," she said. "I know that." By the second year of their marriage, the farm had taken on the particular quality of a place that has been genuinely loved into being, the kind of quality that is visible in small accumulated things, a gate that swings properly, a garden that has been expanded twice, books stacked in 2 places now because one shelf is no longer sufficient, a second rocking chair on the south porch because on clear evenings after supper they both wanted to sit outside, and the single chair they'd started with was an insufficiency that had resolved itself quickly. Neighbors came and were received. Mrs. Alderman came out twice from Caldwell and declared the kitchen to be very sensibly arranged and was clearly gratified by this. The Schultz children came constantly, and Anna tutored the 2 older ones in reading and arithmetic on Thursday afternoons, which began as a practical arrangement and became something she genuinely looked forward to. In the spring of 1880, Anna knew she was expecting. She told Ira in the morning, before he had gone out to the animals, in the simple, direct way she told him things of importance. He sat very still for a moment after she said it, in the way he sometimes sat still when something was happening inside him that required the stillness, and then he looked at her, and his face was the fullest she had ever seen it, full of something she recognized as joy but larger than the word usually carried, and he said, "Are you feeling well? Are you all right?" "I am feeling perfectly well," she said, "and I am more than all right." He got up and came around the table, and she stood, and he held her in the way that felt, after 2 years, like the most natural thing in the world. And she felt his hands at her back and his chin at her temple, and she thought, with the same certainty she had felt on the Kansas plains the November he took her hand, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The pregnancy was straightforward in most respects, helped considerably by the fact that Mrs. Crane from the boarding house had moved out of Caldwell and into a small house nearby the previous year, and had appointed herself a regular visitor who brought reliable practical advice and baked goods. Mrs. Pryor's wife from town sent a doctor out to check on Anna at the 6-month mark, and the doctor declared her in excellent health and the baby positioned correctly, and said she should expect no particular complications. There were no particular complications. On a morning in late November of 1880, with a light snow falling on the Kansas plains and the fire banked high in the bedroom hearth, a son was born. He was a healthy, loud, thoroughly opinionated baby boy who made his displeasure at the arrival process extremely clear from the first moment of his existence, and Anna held him against her and looked down at his red, angry face, and felt something she could not adequately describe and did not try to. Ira was in the room. She had wanted him there and he had wanted to be there, and Mrs. Crane, who had extensive experience with this particular kind of occasion, had permitted it without comment. He was sitting in the chair by the window when she looked up, and his face was entirely undone, which she had never seen before, open in a way it had never been. All the careful, steady control dissolved into something raw and true and beautiful. "Come here," she said. He came. She put the boy into his arms with the careful instruction to support the head, and Ira held his son for the first time with the same deliberate care he brought to everything, only magnified by approximately 10,000%, and looked down at him and then up at Anna and said nothing at all for a long moment. "His name," she said. "What do you want to call him?" Ira said. She had been thinking about this. "Robert," she said, "for my father who was a good man." Ira nodded slowly. "Robert," he said, and said it again, quietly, to the baby. "Robert Barker." Robert Barker expressed his opinion of the name with the kind of howl that left no doubt about the strength of his lungs. Mrs. Crane took him briefly so that Anna could rest, and Ira came to the edge of the bed and sat on the chair beside her, and she took his hand, and they listened to the small sounds of their son in the next room and the snow against the window and the fire, and she thought about October 2 years before, the auction square and the cold platform and the 7 men looking at her, and the one man who was not. She thought about how she had remembered it afterward, that particular specific detail, the one bidder who did not look at her like livestock, and how she had carried it like a piece of evidence through everything that followed, used it as the basis for a decision to trust him enough to go to the sheriff, and how that small initial trust had led, through a chain of days and conversations and Sunday walks and a January wedding and a kitchen garden and a shared shelf of books and a south-facing porch, and now this. A son and a home, and a life that was genuinely and completely hers. She thought about how she would tell Robert that story someday. Not to frighten him, but to tell him the truth about how things worked, about how sometimes the most important moment is a small one, a man who does not look at you a certain way, a held gaze in a crowded square, and how from that small moment a whole life can unfold if you pay attention and if you are brave enough to act on what you notice. "What are you thinking about?" Ira said. "The auction," she said. "I think about it sometimes, not with fear, just thinking about it." "I know," he said. "I think about it too. You were angry that day," she said. "I could see it before you bid. You were reading that paper and you were angry." "Yes. I could see that it was not at me," she said. "That's what I noticed, that the anger was at the right thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I saw you from across the square," he said, "and I thought, that woman is holding herself together by force of will alone, and she should not have to be doing that, and it made me furious in a way I had not expected." He paused. "I had gone there with the intention of outbidding anyone and getting you out of the situation, but I had not anticipated what it would feel like to actually see it." "You did not look at me the way the others did," she said. "No," he said, "I could not have." She laced her fingers through his. "I remembered that when you asked me at the sheriff's office whether I was willing to come with you. I had that one piece of information about you, the way you had looked or the way you had not looked, and I built a decision on it. It is a very small piece of information." "It turned out to be accurate," he said. "Yes, it did," she said. "It turned out to be entirely accurate." She fell asleep shortly after, still holding his hand, and outside the snow went on falling on the Kansas plains in the patient, unhurried way of winter snow, covering the fence posts and the garden and the long flat grass that ran all the way to the horizon. And inside the fire burned, and Robert Barker slept in his cradle, and Ira sat beside his wife in the lamplight and held her hand and let the evening come. In the years that followed, the Barker farm grew in the way that farms grow when they are tended by capable and committed people, a little each year, each increment both modest and consequential. Ira expanded the herd and built a proper barn in the winter of 1881, with the help of the Schultz men and 2 other neighboring families, one of those communal construction events that the frontier produced with a regularity that was one of its better qualities. Anna finished adding the extension to the house that they had been planning since the previous year, a proper sitting room with south-facing windows and enough wall space for the books, which had by that point multiplied to the point where the previous shelving was structurally insufficient. Robert was a child of enormous personality. By the time he was 2, he had strong opinions about everything within his orbit and expressed them without reservation, and Anna recognized in him a quality she had been told she herself possessed in abundance, which was that he engaged with the world as if it were a problem he could solve if he just thought about it hard enough. He was Ira's shadow from the moment he could follow, toddling after his father to the barn and to the pasture fence, and standing at the corral with his small hands on the bottom rail, watching the horses with the serious attention of someone conducting an important assessment. In 1882, a daughter was born. They named her Clara, for Ira's sister who had died of the fever in Tennessee, and she arrived in the world with considerably less protest than her brother had managed, looking at everything with the wide-eyed silence of someone gathering information. Where Robert was vocal, Clara was observant. Where Robert ran at things, Clara watched them first. Anna looked at her small daughter and recognized another quality she had been told she possessed, which was the arithmetic courage of a person who counted things before committing. The spring of 1883 brought a second son, a boy they named Henry, who was from the first day of his life the most amiable of the 3, regarding the world with a benevolent interest that suggested he had already decided it was fundamentally a good place and was prepared to enjoy it. Henry laughed before he was supposed to laugh and walked before he was supposed to walk, and by the time he was 2 had charmed every adult in the county into providing him with whatever he wanted, which Ira said was a skill worth having and Anna said needed to be managed carefully so it did not calcify into something less appealing. Their life together was not without its difficulties, because no life is. There were years when the cattle prices dropped and the margins went thin, and the decisions about the farm accounts were made with the arithmetic pencil and a particular grimness. There was a drought in the summer of 1884 that turned the kitchen garden brown and worried the creek level and made Ira quiet with a worried quiet that Anna recognized and sat with rather than trying to talk him out of. There were the ordinary difficulties of raising 3 children in a house that was perpetually somewhat smaller than the ambitions of the people who inhabited it, the negotiations and compromises and occasional failures of patience that belonged to that particular project. There was the winter when Robert was 5 and contracted a chest ailment that frightened Anna with a depth she had not previously experienced, because it was the first time she had sat by a child's bed through a dangerous night, and the fear that moved through her during those hours was the fear she had named to Ira years before, the fear of losing something worth keeping. The doctor came from Caldwell and Robert recovered, slowly and then completely, and emerged from the illness with a new appreciation for his mother's cooking that was both touching and practical. Through all of it, through the lean years and the frightened nights and the ordinary friction of a shared life, the thing between her and Ira remained what it had been and grew deeper than it had been. They had, she thought, the kind of marriage that looked unremarkable from the outside, which was because the remarkable parts were internal, visible only in the specific texture of a conversation, or the way he brought her coffee before she asked, or the way she knew, after 6 years, exactly what the set of his jaw meant and what the various qualities of his silences contained. She still wore the blue dress on occasions of significance. He still took his hat off for her. In the summer of 1884, Tom Reedy retired from the sheriff's office, and a gathering was held in his honor at the church hall in Caldwell, to which the Barkers came with all 3 children, Robert 4 and Clara 2 and Henry 9 months, and considerably interested in everyone's food. Anna sat at a table with Mrs. Alderman, who was 80 years old and as sharp as she had ever been, and Mrs. Crane, who had developed a specific attachment to Henry that he reciprocated with enthusiasm, and they ate and talked, and the children ran between the tables with the other children in that specific chaotic joy that belonged to community gatherings. Reedy made a speech that was mercifully brief and thanked his wife and his deputies and the people of the county. Anna thought about the afternoon 5 years ago when she had sat across from him and told him what had happened on the Holt ranch, and how he had written it down and gone to Holt the following afternoon, and how that action had been part of the chain. She went and found him before the evening was over and shook his hand, and said she was glad he had been the sheriff of this county when she needed one. And he said, with the gruff sincerity of a man who was not accustomed to receiving this kind of gratitude, that he was glad he could do something useful about it. In the autumn of 1885, 6 years after the wedding, on a Sunday evening in October when the light was the same quality it had been the day of the auction, and the air had the same cold edge, and the plains ran out to the horizon in all their flat gold honesty, Anna and Ira sat on the south porch in their 2 rocking chairs with the children inside being supervised by Mrs. Crane, who had come for supper and stayed for the evening as she often did, and the quiet of the plains came in around them. She was 29 years old, he was 34, the farm was doing well, the cattle numbers were the best they had been. Robert was starting at the schoolhouse in Caldwell that month, which had produced in him a complicated mixture of anticipation and philosophical objection that they were navigating together. Clara had asked approximately 400 questions about horses in the past week, and Ira had promised her a lesson on a very gentle horse in the spring. A promise he had given with the expression of a man who understood this was the beginning of something significant. Henry had learned 3 new words that morning and announced each of them to anyone in the vicinity with great solemnity. "Are you content?" Ira said. It was a word he used sometimes instead of happy, because he had a particular precision with words and content meant something specific that happy did not quite capture, meaning a satisfaction that was not the absence of want but the presence of enough. "I am," she said, "very." The evening star was out over the western horizon, bright against the darkening sky, and the smoke from the chimney went up straight in the still air. "I keep thinking," she said, "about how differently it might have gone. All of it the series of contingencies." "Don't think about that," he said gently. "I think about it in a grateful way," she said, "not a frightened way." "All right," he said. She looked at him in the evening light. He was looking at the western sky, and his profile was as familiar to her as her own hands, the line of his jaw and his nose, and the way his hair still needed cutting, because it always needed cutting, and she had long since stopped mentioning it because she had come to find it endearing, this small, persistent imperfection in an otherwise meticulous man. "I love you," she said. He turned his head and looked at her with the directness he always brought to receiving this, not deflecting it or minimizing it but taking it at full weight. "I love you," he said, "more than I have any good words for." "I know," she said. "I know you do." The evening settled around them. Inside, one of the children said something and Mrs. Crane responded, and there was a small burst of laughter, Henry's recognizable above the rest, and the sound of it came out through the window and mixed with the evening air, and Anna felt it in the same place she had felt the auctioneer's gavel years ago, in her sternum, but entirely differently, like a bell tuned to a different note. The note was this. The note was a south-facing porch and an evening star, and a man in the rocking chair beside her, and 3 children, inside being ridiculous, and a kitchen garden that would need to be put to bed before the real cold came, and a blue dress folded carefully in the cedar chest upstairs, and a book she was partway through on the sitting-room table, and a farm that was doing well and a life that was genuinely and completely and irreversibly hers. She rocked in the evening quiet, and the plains spread out in every direction, enormous and patient and utterly without sentiment, just as they had always been, just as they would be long after she was gone, and she thought there was something right about living in the middle of a landscape like this, something clarifying about the scale of it, the way it kept you honest about what mattered, because everything that didn't matter looked very small against it. What mattered was here, on this porch, in this light. In the sound of her children laughing inside, and the warm weight of her husband's presence beside her, and the star overhead, and the wood smoke, and the cold coming in from the north, and the full, unbrokered, unhurried fact of a life built from a single moment of seeing clearly. He had not looked at her like livestock. She had remembered that when he asked, and all the rest had followed. In the winter of 1885, just before Christmas, Anna discovered she was expecting again, their 4th, and told Ira on the same kitchen morning in the same simple, direct way as she had with the others, and he received it in the same way, the stillness first and then the fullness, and she thought that some things were worth repeating and that this was one of them. The child would arrive in the summer of 1886 and would be, as it turned out, another daughter, a girl named Ruth, who came into the world in July with a complete composure that suggested she had assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Ruth Barker was, from the first, extraordinarily patient. Where Robert charged and Clara observed and Henry charmed, Ruth waited. She waited with a quality of stillness that had nothing passive about it, the waiting of someone who understood that time was an ally. Anna saw herself in all 3 of the older ones in various ways, but in Ruth she saw something she recognized with particular intimacy. The patience of a woman who understands that the best position from which to act is one in which you have gathered all available information first. She would be fine, Anna thought, watching her 4th child sleep in the long summer evenings. All of them would be fine. She was quite certain of this, in the way she was certain of things she had worked out with care and evidence. Robert would grow up earnest and determined, with his father's steadiness and his mother's arithmetic and a stubbornness about justice that both of them recognized, and neither of them intended to discourage. Clara would grow up asking questions about horses and getting answers and becoming, in all probability, someone who worked with them in the serious professional way she already approached everything. Henry would move through the world trailing goodwill like a comet trailing light, making friends of everyone he encountered, and would be the one they would always be slightly worried about in the specific way you worry about the luminously sociable, not about their capacity for joy, but about their capacity for disappointment. And Ruth would wait and watch and choose precisely and be fine. Ira continued to take his hat off when she came into a room. She continued to wear the blue dress on occasions of significance, and by 1886 there were many, the children's birthdays and the anniversaries and the gatherings that had become traditions, and the dress had been carefully maintained and carefully repaired at the one spot where the hem had given, and she thought it would last another 20 years if she continued to treat it with the respect it deserved. The farm would grow. The children would grow. The years would come and go on the Kansas plains with their specific weather and their specific quality of sky and light. The winters that came in hard from the north, and the springs that turned the grass from brown to green almost overnight, and the summers of enormous violent thunderstorms that rolled in from the west and lit the sky for hours, and the autumns that smelled of wood smoke and cold, and the particular golden quality of Kansas October light. They would grow old together on this land. She was certain of that as well, with the same quality of certainty, the kind that is not hope but something more solid, a conclusion based on evidence, on 6 years of evidence and 3 children and a fourth and a kitchen garden and a south-facing porch and a shared shelf of books and the specific weight of a hand held across a kitchen table. They would grow old together, and it would be enough. It would be more than enough. It would be, in every meaningful sense of the word, everything. Anna Chandler, who had stood on a platform in a Kansas town square at 22 years old and been looked at like livestock by 6 out of 7 men, and who had been saved by the 7th not because he was a hero, but because he was simply a decent man who could not look away from something wrong, had made from that beginning, from that one small piece of evidence, a whole and sufficient and genuinely joyful life. She thought about this sometimes, in the mornings before the house woke up, standing in the kitchen with her coffee and watching the early light come across the plains. She thought about the series of decisions, each one hinging on the one before, each one possible only because of the one that preceded it. The decision to look at him, the decision to answer his question honestly, the decision to go to the sheriff, the decision to stay in Caldwell, the decision to say yes in the boarding house parlor before he finished asking, the decision, each day thereafter, to be fully present in the life she was building. None of them had been easy exactly. None of them had been made without cost or without the particular courage that is required to trust a thing you cannot yet fully see. But they had all been hers. That was the part that mattered most, she thought, standing in the kitchen light while her family slept and the planes ran out in every direction, enormous and patient and true. The decisions had all been hers, made with her own arithmetic courage, and the life that had resulted from them was therefore, in the deepest sense, her own. On a Sunday morning in October of 1886, 8 years almost to the day from the auction, the Barker family walked out onto the south-facing porch together in the morning light, all 6 of them, Robert nearly 6 and very serious about his new reading primer, Clara 4, and asking about the horses in the east pasture, Henry 3, and engaged in a complicated negotiation with a piece of corn bread, and Ruth 3 months old, and regarding the plains from her mother's arms with that characteristic composure. Ira stood at the porch rail with his coffee and looked out at the land he had worked for 6 years, and Anna stood beside him with their youngest daughter against her shoulder, and the October light came down warm and gold across everything, and the grass moved in the prairie wind, and the sky was that particular Kansas blue that went all the way up and kept going. "Good morning," he said to her. "Good morning," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it, and Ruth made a small sound of assessment, and Robert began reading aloud from his primer with great solemnity, and Clara pointed out 3 specific horses by name, and Henry successfully resolved the corn-bread negotiation, and the morning went on, warm and bright and entirely ordinary, in the way that the best mornings are, in the way that the best lives are, the mornings and the lives that look unremarkable from the outside and contain, on the inside, everything that matters. The plains ran wide and the sky ran wide, and the Barker farm sat in the middle of all that space, solid and lived in and loved, and the smoke went up from the chimney in the still October air, and it was enough. It was, in every possible way, more than enough.